They didn't expect the answer to be no. Not them. Not the couple who once commanded global headlines with a single wave, a single smile, a single perfectly timed photo op. So when the Australian embassy delivered a response that felt more like a door slammed shut than a polite diplomatic gesture, the shock ricocheted straight back to Montecito. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. But that's not even the most surprising part. The real question is this: why did Australia reject them now, and why so decisively? Before we dive into the paperwork, the emails, the calls, and the furious behind-the-scenes meltdown, I want you to imagine the exact moment this story began to unravel. Because it didn't start with an application. It didn't even start with a trip. It started with desperation. A quiet, unspoken desperation. The kind that creeps into a public image that has begun to crack. The kind that makes powerful people reach for something familiar, like a country where they once received overwhelming crowds, screaming fans, and the illusion of global adoration. The kind that makes them believe that maybe, just maybe, one dramatic return could change the narrative. But Australia wasn't buying it. And that's where everything exploded. Let's rewind just a little. Back to the moment when the idea of a triumphant return to Australia first entered their heads. Why Australia? Why now? Why did they think a country that has grown more outspoken, more skeptical, and more politically guarded would roll out the red carpet? Maybe they thought nostalgia would work. Maybe they believed their titles still carried weight. Maybe they assumed that the warm reception of 2018 still lingered in memory. But here's the thing. Time changes everything. Public sentiment shifts. Governments shift. Laws tighten. People start asking questions they never asked before. Like, why are they coming back? And what exactly do they want from Australia this time? You see, Australia remembers the last time they came. The royal tour of 2018 was one of the most chaotic and expensive events in recent memory. Crowds were massive. Security costs soared. Every minute was planned, tested, rehearsed, coordinated. But beneath the glamour, officials remember the strain. Paparazzi overwhelming police barricades, Meghan's rumored behind-the-scenes demands, confusion about unscheduled stops, and rising tension between the Sussex team and Australian security. Most of that was kept out of the press. Until now. Because when their application landed at the embassy this year, it didn't take long for someone to ask, do we really want to do this again? That question sat at the center of a storm waiting to break. And the timing of their request only added fuel to the fire. Australia has been tightening its immigration scrutiny, especially for individuals with commercial interests, documentary crews, or high-security risk entourages. The process has become stricter, more precise, and far less forgiving, even for celebrities, even for former royalty. So when the embassy saw the names on the application, they didn't rush anything. They didn't bend. They didn't bow. They followed protocol. But here's the twist. This wasn't a normal application. Something in that file made several staff members sit up straighter. A detail Meghan included. A timeline that didn't match. An attachment that raised more questions than answers. That was the moment the curiosity started. And curiosity is a powerful thing, especially inside a government building. But the real storm didn't begin until someone remembered a confidential report created years ago, one that had quietly lived in an internal system. A report that reevaluated the aftermath of the Sussexes' 2018 tour. A report that, until now, had never mattered. But suddenly, it mattered a lot. And once that report resurfaced, the embassy's position shifted from cautious interest to full-scale scrutiny. But let's pause for a moment. Because before we get to the red flags, the phone calls, and the decision that sent shockwaves across the Pacific, you need to understand the emotional stakes behind this story. You need to understand why Harry and Meghan wanted this return so badly, and why the rejection hit them like a sledgehammer. Imagine being Harry, once the most beloved royal of his generation, once the soldier prince, once the man people thought might reshape the monarchy. Now a man whose relationship with entire nations is shifting beneath his feet. Australia was one of the few countries where he felt that old magic, where the smiles were real, where the crowds were enormous, where he felt the warmth that reminded him of Diana's connection with the world. He wanted that again. He needed that again. And Meghan? She had her own reasons. A return to Australia came with strategic value. It was perfect for a documentary episode. Perfect for a PR reset. perfect for reclaiming lost global footing, perfect for proving they could still move crowds, influence narratives, and generate headlines that weren't negative. But intentions only carry you so far, especially when someone else has the final say. Inside the embassy, officials began heated internal discussions. Some worried about political backlash, some worried about security issues, some questioned whether the visit would be used for media purposes, some feared the public reaction, and others wondered if approving the visit might send the wrong message after years of polarization. Yet none of them expected what happened next. Because a situation that started as a routine application suddenly escalated into one of the most sensitive diplomatic flashpoints of the year. Why? Because Meghan's team made a move that blindsided everyone. A message arrived from Montecito, a message that was supposed to clarify their intentions. Instead, it raised more concerns, more red flags, more uncertainty. And as soon as that message was logged, everything accelerated. Internal emails flew across departments. Questions piled up like storm clouds. A senior immigration officer got involved. Security analysts reviewed the file. And somewhere along the line, someone in Canberra, the capital, requested that the decision be escalated to a higher review panel. That never happens for former royals. Never. Unless something in the file triggers it. So what was it? What did they find? Before we reach that, let's focus on the emotional temperature inside the embassy. Imagine a handful of staff members staring at a request that feels like an international minefield. Imagine the pressure of knowing that every decision will be scrutinized by politicians, the media, and the public. Imagine understanding that approving the visit could create backlash, and rejecting it could create even more. This wasn't just paperwork. It was a headache waiting to become a headline. Meanwhile, back in California, Harry and Meghan were confident. Very confident. They believed the visit was a formality. They believed their names still carried weight. They believed Australia would welcome them back with open arms. But the embassy saw something different. They saw contradictions. They saw inconsistencies. They saw unanswered questions. And most importantly, they saw risk. Not personal risk. Political risk. Because approving a return for two of the most controversial figures in modern royal history is not something done lightly. Not anymore. And then came the call. A direct call from Harry himself. That's when everything blew open. Why did he call? Was it fear of rejection? Was it frustration? Was it an attempt to smooth things over? Or was he trying to control the narrative before anything leaked? All we know is this. Embassy staff were stunned. Royals, former or not, never do this. They don't pick up the phone. They don't dial government buildings. They don't personally negotiate visa applications. But Harry did. And that call created a ripple effect that made the final decision inevitable. But here's the twist. The rejection wasn't just because of that call. It was because of what came after. A chain reaction that neither Harry nor Meghan could stop. Over the next chapters, we're going to break down every step of this unraveling. The red flags, the private emails, the confidential reports, the meltdown behind closed doors, and the exact moment Australia decided enough was enough. But before we dive deeper, let me leave you with the final moment that closed the introduction and opened the real story. Picture an embassy official clicking send on a message addressed to the couple's representatives. A message that would travel thousands of miles and land quietly, unexpectedly, in Montecito. A message that felt like a diplomatic earthquake. Because when Harry and Meghan opened it, they didn't just read a rejection, they read a warning. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. They weren't supposed to see it that way. Not as an ordinary file. Not as just another visa request tucked between a stack of business travelers, tourists, and students hoping for a semester abroad. But that's exactly how it looked when it first hit the Australian embassy's internal system on a quiet Tuesday morning. A file. A name. A request. Nothing more. Except the names on this particular file weren't ordinary. Not even close. The application arrived digitally at 8:42 a.m., transmitted through the secure diplomatic portal. The moment it was logged, a soft alert beeped across the visa officer's screen, standard practice for high-profile applicants. But the officer who saw it first had no idea that opening that file would ignite one of the most controversial diplomatic decisions of the year. And yet, when she clicked it open, she froze. Prince Henry Charles Albert David. And directly beneath it, Meghan Markle. For a second, she thought it was a joke, a prank, some elaborate test. But the credentials were real. The documentation was real. The digital signature was real. She leaned back in her chair, exhaled slowly, and whispered the only thing that came to mind. Oh, this is going to be a problem. Let's pause for a second. Because you might be wondering, why was this already a problem? Why did a simple visa request send a ripple of dread down the spine of an experienced government worker who had handled diplomats, celebrities, billionaires, and foreign dignitaries? Because in embassies, especially ones representing countries with complicated political landscapes, names carry weight, and some names carry storms. This file, it carried a hurricane. The officer tried to focus. She clicked through the required fields, passport numbers, addresses, declarations, travel intentions. Everything looked polished, carefully curated, almost too clean. But she felt something was off. A gut instinct. The kind you don't ignore when you work in a world where caution often keeps governments out of trouble. She clicked again, and that's when she saw it. Something buried on page 3. A detail so small, so seemingly unimportant, that an untrained eye would have skimmed right past it. But she didn't skim. She stopped. The file noted their purpose of travel, but something about the wording created an immediate contradiction with the dates listed in another section. It wasn't a blatant error, not the kind that gets laughed off and corrected with a follow-up email. It was a discrepancy, a red flag disguised as a typo. And in the world of international embassies, discrepancies, especially in the travel intentions of high-profile political figures, are never ignored. She reread it 3 times. The timelines didn't align. The events they claimed to attend were not confirmed publicly. Some activities hinted at private filming. And worse, there were references to commitments that clashed with previously announced media schedules in the United States. In other words, something wasn't adding up. She flagged the file, just for internal review. Nothing dramatic. But that single click sent the application down a very different path. Within minutes, the file landed on the desk of a senior officer, a man with 22 years of experience and an instinct for trouble that had served him well across 4 continents. He opened it with curiosity. But within seconds, his eyebrows knit tightly together. And here's where the real story begins to shift. Because from his perspective, this wasn't about celebrity. This wasn't about royalty. This wasn't even about controversy. This was about risk. Do you know what he said when he saw the file? Not this again. Those 3 words traveled across the office like an electric current. A few younger officers glanced over, wondering what he meant. But the older ones knew. They remembered 2018. They remembered the chaos. They remembered the memo that circulated after the tour, the one almost no one talked about publicly. Because when Harry and Meghan visited Australia during their royal tour, the crowds were enormous, yes. The headlines were glowing, yes. But privately, officials had documented dozens of issues. Risk concerns, security complaints, unplanned schedule deviations, tense exchanges between Meghan's team and local staff. The kind of incidents that never make it into glossy press photos. And some of those incidents had made their way into an internal report. A report now sitting quietly in the archives of the immigration database. A report the senior officer immediately pulled up. He clicked, and there it was. Pages and pages of classified assessments. Officials describing paparazzi overruns. Security teams overwhelmed to the point of near collapse. Requests made at the last second that violated established protocols. Local police reporting unmanageable crowd control. Diplomats noting communication breakdowns that created international headaches. And tucked between the lines, subtle concerns about the couple's unpredictability. Especially Meghan's. That file had been dormant for years. Dusty. Forgotten. Irrelevant. Until now. As soon as he reviewed it, everything changed. He didn't close the new visa application. He didn't dismiss it. He didn't laugh it off. Instead, he leaned forward, narrowed his eyes, and began reading through every word with the precision of a surgeon. There was an air of tension building around him. One of the junior officers whispered, "Is everything okay?" He didn't answer. He kept scrolling. Then he saw it. A section of the application that referenced a private project, one that clearly involved filming. But the wording was vague. Too vague. Australia has strict rules about filming permits, commercial shoots, and media projects involving international personalities. You can't just step off the plane with a Netflix crew and start recording public property or private sessions. You need approval. You need permits. You need transparency. The Sussex application? None of that was present. But that wasn't the moment everything shifted. Not yet. The real shift happened 1 hour later, when the senior officer called a quiet internal meeting in a room normally used for sensitive diplomatic briefings. You know a situation is serious when an embassy calls a meeting for a single visa request. Inside that room, he placed the application on the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize anything. He simply said, "We need to be very careful. There are inconsistencies." And the room fell silent. One officer asked, "Is it fraud?" He shook his head. "No, but something's not clear. And we can't process this like a standard case." They reviewed everything line by line. Travel purpose, projected dates, estimated length of stay, unusual language in Meghan's section, tight secrecy surrounding their planned appearances, and that strange attachment that one officer described as too scripted. By the end of the meeting, they all understood the same thing. This wasn't going to be easy. Not for them. Not for Canberra. Not for anyone. The senior officer made the call. "We need higher approval." And with that, the file was escalated to a special review team. Something that almost never happens unless the applicant is tied to national security, international politics, or controversial public perception. Meanwhile, outside the embassy walls, the world continued unaware. Meghan was filming something in California. Harry was coordinating charity work. Their PR team was preparing for what they thought would be a triumphant announcement of an Australian return. But back at the embassy, concerns were multiplying. A younger officer noticed an unusual clause. The couple requested certain privacy arrangements that exceeded standard diplomatic accommodations. It wasn't illegal, but it was unusual, especially for non-working royals. Another noticed the lack of a clear itinerary. Another noticed references to public engagement opportunities, a phrase often used by PR teams when planning stage public appearances. Every detail raised a question. Every question raised another. It wasn't long before someone asked the one question no embassy ever wants to ask. What are they really coming here for? Because the application didn't read like a simple visit. It read like a production, a strategy, a carefully planned piece of global image rehabilitation disguised as a goodwill trip. And that's when the tension began to build. Because if the embassy approved this visit and things went wrong, they would be blamed. If they denied it without cause, they would also be blamed. This was becoming a political trap, a diplomatic minefield, a PR nightmare waiting to happen. But up until this point, everything was quiet, contained, internal. No one outside that embassy office knew that Harry and Meghan's fate in Australia was already hanging by a thread. And then it happened. An email pinged. A new notification appeared. A message from an Australian government department higher up the chain. The senior officer clicked it open. As he read it, his expression changed. His shoulders stiffened. His jaw tightened. The officers around the table exchanged glances. One whispered, "What does it say?" He didn't speak for several seconds. Then finally, "Another department has flagged the application." That sentence hit the room like a thunderclap. Because when another department, the Department of Home Affairs, flags something, it means only one thing. This situation wasn't just complicated. It was sensitive. The visa team exchanged looks of concern. What did they flag it for? He scrolled, paused, then answered quietly. Multiple issues. And one of them is serious. Nobody breathed. Because that meant something deeper was starting to unravel, something Harry and Meghan had no idea was happening. And what the embassy discovered next would change the entire course of the application. There's a reason the embassy didn't rush their decision. A reason the file wasn't stamped, processed, and approved like a celebrity guest list. A reason the entire building seemed to shift into a cautious, almost protective posture the moment those two names appeared on their screens. Because Australia remembers. They remember the last time Harry and Meghan walked across Australian soil. They remember the dazzling public smiles. They remember the cheers, the screaming fans, the packed streets, the newspapers declaring it the biggest royal tour since Diana. But they also remember something else. The chaos behind the curtain. And in government, chaos is never forgotten. It is documented, archived, filed, flagged, and quietly tucked away until the day it becomes relevant again. That day had arrived. The file had been escalated, the atmosphere in the embassy shifted, and multiple departments were suddenly, quietly, reviewing a visit that had not even happened yet. But now, the spotlight widens. Because the suspicious details were only the beginning. The deeper concerns had nothing to do with typos or timeline inconsistencies. They had to do with history. Let's go back. When the Sussexes toured Australia in 2018, the public saw the fairy tale. The newlyweds, the pregnancy announcement, the crowd swelling to numbers that police hadn't handled since Pope John Paul II visited Sydney. The imagery was spectacular. But behind the scenes, there were whispers. Australian federal police struggled to keep paparazzi under control. Local security teams reported communication issues with the Sussex staff. Some stops were added last minute without proper clearance. And Meghan, according to multiple internal notes, had a pattern of last-minute requests that strained logistics and exceeded security budgets. Nothing illegal, nothing scandalous, nothing a government would ever announce publicly, but enough to create a footprint, enough to create a memory, enough to create caution. And caution, once planted, grows roots. So when the visa application landed this time, the old concerns resurfaced like a shadow stretching across the room. One of the senior officers opened the Archive 2018 file again, not out of pettiness or bias, but out of necessity. He needed context. He needed to understand whether the concerns were isolated or part of a pattern. And with every page he reread, the pattern became clearer. Crowd control complications, security protocol conflicts, frustrated local officials, media coordination issues, and the constant presence of international cameras capturing both the curated and the chaotic moments. To put it simply, their visit was a spectacle, and spectacles require management. Management costs money. Management strains resources. Management requires planning that Australia wasn't sure the Sussexes were prepared to deliver this time around. But those were the surface concerns. The deeper concerns? Those weren't about logistics. They were about politics. Because the Sussexes of 2025 are not the Sussexes of 2018. A lot has changed. Australia is no longer dealing with working royals visiting on behalf of the monarchy. They're dealing with two private individuals who publicly criticize global institutions, court media controversy, and strategically position themselves within political and social narratives. That matters. In diplomacy, neutrality is everything. Countries avoid appearing aligned with controversial public figures. They avoid giving the impression of endorsement. They avoid being drawn into narratives that could potentially create political blowback. Inviting Harry and Meghan into Australia is not the same as inviting a Hollywood actor or an A-list musician. It comes with context, history, international implications, and whether Harry and Meghan believe it or not, their relationship with the monarchy, now fractured, casts a long shadow. When they visit countries once tied to the crown, the symbolism matters. The optics matter. The potential interpretations matter. Which brings us to the quiet concerns Australia had been harboring for years. Concern number 1, security risk. Not personal risk, political risk. Harry and Meghan attract unpredictable crowds. Protests, counter-protests, activists, royalists, anti-royalists, sympathizers, critics, the full spectrum. Australia remembers the 2018 crowds. They remember security teams stretched thin. And now, 7 years later, any return would attract not just fans, but critics with loud voices, louder signs, and even louder cameras. Concern number 2, media manipulation. This was one of the biggest internal flags. Governments hate the idea of being used as a backdrop for a media stunt, especially by figures who produce high-budget documentaries and carefully curated public appearances. If the Sussexes intended to film anything, even a private segment, it required disclosure, permits, legal frameworks, coordination with local jurisdictions. But their application didn't mention filming at all. Yet cross-referencing their schedules revealed that Meghan had pending commercial commitments during the same period they planned to be in Australia. That inconsistency wasn't a typo. It was a warning. Concern number 3, diplomatic cleanliness. This one sounds boring, but it's arguably the most important. Countries must maintain diplomatic cleanliness, meaning they cannot appear to take sides in interpersonal royal conflicts. They cannot appear to be used as safe havens. They cannot appear to be stepping into issues between the Sussexes and the monarchy. If Harry and Meghan arrived in Australia, the world would watch. If the trip went poorly, the world would watch harder. And Australia could be blamed for mishandling it. Concern number 4, Commonwealth sensitivity. Australia's relationship with the British monarchy has become increasingly complicated. Republican sentiment is rising. Debates intensify every year. Political parties are divided on whether the monarchy still matters. Now imagine thrusting Harry and Meghan, the couple who left the monarchy and then publicly dismantled its image, into that environment. It would be explosive, socially, politically, culturally. Having them visit could reignite debates that the Australian government doesn't want to revisit right now. Concern number 5, public perception. The Sussexes no longer hold universal approval. For every supporter who sees them as victims of royal rigidity, there's a critic who sees them as opportunistic, inconsistent, or strategically manipulative. The polarization they generate is real, measured, documented, statistically significant. The embassy had polling data from several years of media tracking, and that data showed exactly one thing. Inviting the Sussexes creates division. No government enjoys division. Which brings us back to the embassy. A group of officers sat at a long table, reviewing the application like a bomb technician examines a device. Not because it was dangerous, but because one wrong move could have consequences. One officer asked the question that no one else dared say aloud. What if they're coming here to reshape their global narrative again? Another added, or to use Australia as a sympathetic stage? And another, more quietly, or to provoke a reaction from the royal family? These weren't conspiracy theories. They were possibilities. Legitimate considerations based on past behavior and media trajectories. But there was one concern that overshadowed all the others. One that no officer wanted to address. One that had lingered for years. The Meghan factor. Meghan Markle had made public comments about Australia in interviews and conversations that rubbed certain officials the wrong way. Not insults, not attacks, but implications that Australia's media was too aggressive, too critical, too invasive. Comments that, while accurate from her perspective, had been interpreted as dismissive. Australia does not forget comments made about its institutions, even indirectly, especially when they come from global figures. So when the visa application arrived, these quiet memories bubbled back up. One officer admitted, "I just don't know if she even likes Australia." Another added, "We can't risk becoming the villain in whatever narrative they're building next." And perhaps the most blunt comment came from a senior analyst. "We need to protect ourselves." It might sound dramatic, but in the world of diplomacy, protecting the nation's reputation is a core priority. And reputations can be damaged in unexpected ways, especially by powerful storytellers with global platforms. Now, let's move deeper inside the embassy. It was around 11:30 a.m. when the room reviewing the file began to fill with more people. Staff from Home Affairs, representatives from the Immigration Legal Department, and even one official from a communications office who rarely attended meetings unless a situation had the potential to explode publicly. Their presence was telling. It signaled rising concern. They sat, they read, they compared notes. And then someone finally said what everyone was thinking. This is not a standard visit. We are not just hosting tourists. We are potentially hosting a global controversy. That sentence shifted the oxygen in the room. Because once a situation is labeled a global controversy, decisions become slow, careful, deliberate. Every detail is analyzed for potential fallout. One officer, newer, bolder, asked a direct question. "So what's the actual problem? If they want to come, let them come." A senior official turned to him and spoke the kind of sentence that reveals the entire heart of this chapter. "You don't understand. When high-profile people visit a country, the country becomes part of their story, and we need to be very sure we want to be part of theirs." That line hung in the air like smoke. Australia wasn't just considering the logistics. They were considering the consequences. Meanwhile, the embassy did something that surprised even them. They contacted a few individuals who had been part of the 2018 tour. Former security personnel, media liaisons, local coordinators, government staff who had worked closely with the Sussex team. They didn't ask for gossip. They asked for experiences, facts, concerns, insight. The responses? Mixed. but revealing. Some praised Harry as respectful, cooperative, patient. Others described Meghan as demanding, exacting, or difficult to accommodate under strict protocol. Some recalled miscommunications. Others mentioned strained interactions with local staff who weren't prepared to handle last-minute adjustments. Individually, these details meant nothing. Together, they meant everything. They painted a picture of unpredictability. And unpredictability is dangerous in diplomacy. But the embassy's concerns didn't end there. Because as the team reviewed more details in the application, they noticed something that made their stomachs drop. A date conflict. A clash between Meghan's scheduled appearance in the United States and the proposed travel dates to Australia. This wasn't a minor issue. This wasn't an oversight. This was a contradiction that suggested one of two things. Either the application was incomplete, or there was another motive behind the trip that hadn't been disclosed. The officers exchanged glances. No one wanted to say it aloud, but they all understood. The Sussexes weren't coming to Australia for just one reason. The application was hiding something, and what the embassy discovered next would pull the rug out from under everything they thought they understood. You could almost hear the shift in the room the moment they clicked on Meghan's section of the application. It was subtle at first, just a quiet murmur, the soft click of a mouse slowing down, an officer leaning closer to the screen as if trying to understand what they were looking at. Then it escalated. Because within seconds, everyone realized something wasn't right. And it started with a single line. A line that should have been simple, basic, straightforward. But it wasn't. The question on the form was simple. What is the primary purpose of your visit? Most people write the truth. Tourism, business, family, conference. But Meghan's answer? It wasn't any of those. Not clearly, anyway. Instead, her response felt rehearsed, curated, precise in a way that tried too hard to be vague. It read like a sentence plucked out of a PR-approved talking point, the kind that avoids clarity while implying purpose, the kind that says everything and nothing at the same time. One officer whispered, "What does that even mean?" Another replied, "Whatever it means, it doesn't match the dates listed." And that was the first red flag. But it wasn't the last. Because as they scrolled deeper, something far more concerning appeared. A timeline inconsistency. A clash between Meghan's stated schedule and events already publicly confirmed in the United States. A calendar conflict so obvious that the officers stared at it in disbelief. It wasn't a small mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was either carelessness or concealment, and embassies are trained to assume the latter when high-profile applicants are involved. One officer took off his glasses and rubbed his forehead. This doesn't make sense. Why would she list these dates when they don't align with her public appearances? Another officer countered softly. Unless she's hiding something. That sentence changed the entire tone in the room. Suddenly, every word in Meghan's declaration felt like a clue. Every attachment felt like evidence. Every detail felt like a thread leading somewhere deeper. So they kept reading. And then came the second red flag. The attachment. A document Meghan's team included to support the purpose of travel. Officers expected a formal letter, an invitation from an Australian organization, or a schedule of planned engagements. But what they found was something entirely different. It was too polished, too vague, too carefully written. It read like a media pitch, talking about opportunities, positive public engagement, shared global initiatives. But it lacked specificity. It lacked substance. It lacked anything that made it clear why she needed to be in Australia at all. The more they read it, the more obvious the problem became. This wasn't a travel document. It was a PR document. Something designed to sell the trip rather than explain it. Something crafted to impress, not inform. And worst of all, it didn't answer the one question every visa application must answer. Why here? Why now? In other words, what was the real reason they wanted to enter Australia at this exact moment? One officer muttered, "Is she applying for a visa or pitching a documentary idea?" Another said, "This attachment is not normal." By now, the embassy staff weren't dealing with confusion. They were dealing with suspicion. And that's when they noticed the third red flag. A discrepancy in Meghan's declaration. A specific section asked whether she intended to engage in any media-related activities while in Australia. Standard question. Straightforward. Easy to answer honestly. Meghan checked no. Normally, that would be fine. except that one of the younger officers had already cross-referenced her media schedule and discovered something troubling. She had upcoming commitments linked to a documentary project, and based on leaked industry information, the project included possible international travel. Suddenly, the no became a problem, a big one, because if Meghan intended to film anything, even private scenes, she needed a special permit. If she intended to record interviews, she needed clearance. If she planned to do any sort of media production, even casually, the embassy had to know. But this application? It revealed nothing. One officer leaned back in her chair, her expression hardening. Either she forgot, or she didn't want us to know. Neither answer was comforting. But the fourth red flag? That was the one that made everyone's stomach drop. It was a comment Meghan added in the optional notes section. A small paragraph meant to clarify her intentions, but instead, it raised far more questions. The phrasing was strange, almost defensive. She expressed a desire to reconnect with the people who supported us during a pivotal time, which seemed innocent enough. But embassies aren't naive. They understand narrative. They understand image management. They understand when someone is trying to reclaim lost public support. Her wording suggested she intended to use Australia as a stage, as a reset button, as a platform. Governments don't appreciate being used that way. And as soon as they interpreted that sentence as strategic rather than personal, everything changed. A senior officer pushed his chair back slightly and said the 5 words that shift a situation from complicated to serious. We need a full background review. When an embassy orders a background review on a high-profile figure, it triggers multiple checks: political, legal, media, security, reputation risk. Within an hour, officials began searching databases, reviewing archives, and examining any public or private details that could affect diplomatic handling. And almost immediately, the concerns multiplied, because the background review pulled up a history that raised eyebrows across the room. Meghan's public conflicts with British media, her accusations against institutions, her ongoing legal battles, her high-profile interviews, her strained relationship with the royal family, her tendency to be at the center of global controversy. None of this made her unwelcome, but it made her high risk. In diplomacy, high-risk individuals require transparency. Her application had the opposite. One of the senior analysts summarized it perfectly. She's not giving us the full truth. And if even one part of a high-profile application is unclear, everything becomes unclear. Embassies don't take chances like that. Not with celebrities. Not with royals. Not with anyone who can ignite a media firestorm. By this point, the review team was almost certain they needed additional clarification from Meghan's representatives. They prepared a request for more details, additional documentation, and a clearer explanation of the intended activities. But before they could hit send, an email arrived from Montecito, directly from Meghan's team, sent at the exact moment the embassy was preparing to question them. The subject line read, "Urgent clarification regarding travel." The officers exchanged uneasy looks. It was too perfectly timed, too coincidental, too convenient. They opened it, and what they read only confirmed their fears. The email was long, polished, overly gracious, and dripping with PR language instead of diplomatic transparency. It attempted to preempt questions the embassy hadn't even asked yet, almost as if Meghan's team knew the file was being scrutinized. But the content had a problem. Actually, several. First, it introduced new details about the purpose of the trip that weren't in the application itself. Second, it made vague references to unplanned but possible media opportunities, which contradicted the checked box of no media activity. Third, it suggested the Sussexes expected certain courtesies typically reserved for working royals, a status they no longer held. And then came the most alarming part: the tone. The message wasn't hostile, but it wasn't humble either. It read like an assumption, as if the embassy would of course bend protocol, as if the rules didn't fully apply, as if the visit was already a guaranteed event. One officer shook his head. "This email doesn't clarify anything. It complicates everything." Another added, "It sounds like they want us to approve first and ask questions later. But embassies don't operate that way. They must know. They must verify. They must protect the integrity of the process." And now? Everything in Meghan's section raised doubts. Doubts about transparency. Doubts about intentions. Doubts about compliance. doubts about the true purpose of the trip. But the final red flag came from the background review, not the application. Because during the review, an analyst discovered a confidential intelligence note from a separate department. Not about Meghan, about the Sussexes as a unit. A note that flagged them for potential media-driven diplomatic risk. Not danger, not wrongdoing, not threat, diplomatic risk. Meaning, this couple may create political or social complications if not handled with extreme care. The room fell silent as the officer read the line aloud. Everyone understood the implication. If they allowed the visit and something went wrong, it would fall on them. And then, as if the universe wanted to turn suspicion into certainty, the phone on the senior officer's desk rang. He answered it, listened, sat completely still. When he hung up, the room stared at him. "What was that?" someone asked. His response was quiet. Too quiet. "A department in Canberra wants us to freeze the application. There's a development." The room tensed. "What development?" He hesitated. And then he said it. "We received a flagged call from the United States." Everyone froze. Because flag calls aren't casual. They aren't routine. They aren't friendly updates. Flag calls mean only one thing. Someone important wants to complicate the situation, and no one yet knows why. But what came next would shake the embassy far more than any document in the file. Because the next communication wouldn't come from a bureaucrat, or a government office, or a political advisor. It would come from Harry himself. And that's when the story would explode. The phone shouldn't have rung. Not like that. Not at that moment. Not with that tone in the voice of the officer answering it. But that's how everything changed. Because when the senior officer lifted the receiver that afternoon, he wasn't expecting to hear anyone notable. Maybe someone from Canberra. Maybe someone from immigration. Maybe a routine inquiry about processing times. Nothing unusual. Instead, the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Firm. Polite. But carrying a tension that vibrated through the line. This was no staffer. No assistant. No representative. It was Harry. Yes, Harry himself. Calling a government embassy directly. The officer blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. But when Harry repeated his greeting, slow and calm, the truth sank in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an impersonator. This wasn't a prank. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, though no longer representing the crown, was calling personally to discuss the visa application. And that alone was a major breach of protocol. Because former royals do not call embassies. They do not call government officials. They do not directly ask about their own administrative processes. Not unless something has gone very wrong. Let's pause for a moment. Ask yourself, why would Harry make that call? Fear? Frustration? Damage control? A desire to get ahead of a narrative he sensed slipping out of his hands? Or was it something deeper? Something more desperate? Inside the embassy, silence spread across the room as the senior officer pressed the phone to his ear, stood up, and walked out, closing the door behind him. But even behind closed doors, everyone could feel the shift. Something was about to unfold that none of them were trained for. And it started with Harry saying, "I wanted to reach out personally to clarify a few things in the application." That sentence alone sent chills down the officer's spine. He wasn't supposed to do that. Not him. Not any high-profile figure. Especially not someone whose movements sparked global headlines. The officer responded professionally. "Your Highness, we appreciate the call, but normally." Harry cut in gently. "Please. Just Harry." Those two words said everything. He wasn't calling as royalty. He was calling as a man who felt something slipping. Approval. Control. Opportunity. Maybe all three. The officer cleared his throat, knowing whatever he said now mattered. "Of course. Harry. How can I assist?" Harry took a breath. A long one. Too long. Then he spoke with a tone that sounded rehearsed at first, then cracked at the edges. "We submitted our application with the understanding that everything was straightforward, but I'm hearing there may be complications." Complications. That word carried weight. Enough weight to sink a ship. The officer chose his words carefully. "We are still reviewing the application. Nothing has been decided." But Harry didn't sound reassured. Something in his voice tightened. "We want to make sure there are no misunderstandings. The intention behind our trip is purely positive. We want to reconnect with a place that means a great deal to us." Reconnect. There it was again. The same word Meghan used in her application. The officer took note mentally. Patterns aren't accidental. He remained calm. Of course. But at this stage, we do have standard procedures to follow. There are several areas that require clarification. Harry paused. A pause with weight behind it. And then he said the line that made the officer's eyes flick upward in alarm. I'm aware Meghan's section may have raised questions. I want to clear those up. There it was. Confirmation. He knew. He knew there were issues. He knew they weren't being waved through. He knew the embassy wasn't treating them differently. But how? Who told him? What triggered the sudden panic? The officer scribbled notes on a pad, knowing he would need to report everything word for word later. Harry continued, sounding increasingly anxious. We understand the scheduling conflict may look strange, but there are reasons for that. Private reasons. Not something we intended to hide. Not intended to hide. A confession disguised as reassurance. The officer carefully kept his tone neutral. We simply need accurate information to process the application appropriately. Harry laughed softly, an exhale more than a laugh. I know. It's just, things have been complicated lately. We didn't want to make things harder by oversharing. Oversharing. That word landed like a stone. Because embassies expect oversharing. They need it. They depend on it. They require full transparency. Harry continued, his voice dropping into something quieter. Look, I'm trying to do the right thing here. We want this to go well. We want this opportunity. We want this return to be meaningful. Meaningful. A word drenched in subtext. What did Australia represent to him? Redemption? Nostalgia? Rewriting a narrative that had spun out of his control? The officer asked gently, Are you able to provide more details about the purpose of your visit? There was a long silence. Too long. Then Harry admitted something that confirmed the embassy's deepest suspicions. There may be some unofficial activities. Nothing formal. Nothing that should concern you. Just personal work. Personal work. Every alarm bell in the officer's mind went off at once. Because in diplomacy, personal work is the fog that hides cameras, interviews, meetings, or strategic engagements. And Australia would not allow any of that without proper authorization. Harry, the officer said carefully, trying to navigate the thin ice beneath him. Any activity, official or unofficial, must be disclosed. Even personal projects could require additional permits. Harry inhaled sharply, a subtle sound of frustration. Then he whispered something he probably didn't mean to reveal. We can't put everything on paper right now. There it was. The truth. Not accidental. Not ambiguous. Not overlooked. Hidden. The officer felt the room spinning around him. Because now the embassy knew the real issue. The application wasn't incomplete by accident. It was incomplete by design. But Harry didn't stop there. He added, voice strained, Australia was good to us. It meant something to Meghan. To me. We were hoping this trip could be a fresh start. A fresh start. A reset button. A symbolic return. A second chance at goodwill the world no longer offered freely. Harry continued, We don't want this to become political. We don't want this to create tension. We want this visit to happen. The officer swallowed hard. He could feel the pressure building in the room, even though he stood alone outside the conference door. He couldn't promise anything. He couldn't offer false hope. He couldn't bend protocol, not even for a prince calling from Montecito. He said the safest thing he could. I will make note of everything you've shared and pass it along to the review team. We'll continue processing according to standard procedure. The silence that followed was heavy, disappointed, almost resigned. Then Harry said something nearly whispered, a line that sounded like a man finally realizing his influence wasn't what it once was. I appreciate that. Really. I just hope this doesn't become something bigger than it needs to be. The officer didn't respond immediately, because that line revealed everything Harry feared. Something bigger. Something public. Something political. Something humiliating. A denial. When the call ended, the officer stood still for several seconds, hands still on the receiver, trying to process what had just happened. Then he walked back into the room. The moment he opened the door, all eyes were on him. Well, someone asked. He didn't sit down. He didn't give a summary. He didn't dramatize anything. He simply said, Harry knows we're scrutinizing it, and he's trying to handle it quietly. A murmur spread through the room. They weren't prepared for that. Not for direct involvement. Not for strategic outreach. Not for the emotional undertone in his voice. One officer asked, Did he say why they didn't disclose everything? The senior officer nodded slowly. Yes. He said they couldn't put everything on paper. The room erupted. That's a red flag. That confirms it. That may violate multiple permit requirements. We may have to deny this. And then the most senior official in the room, a man who had remained silent until this moment, spoke firmly. We need to escalate this immediately. This is no longer a routine application. But before they could begin drafting their concerns, another officer glanced at her computer screen and gasped. Sir, something else just came in. Everyone turned. She read the header. A communication from the Department of Home Affairs. Marked urgent. The senior officer asked, What does it say? She swallowed, eyes widening. They flagged a new issue, and they want a full review. What issue? She hesitated, then read the line aloud. Possible inconsistencies with the applicant's stated activities indicate the need for deeper investigation. It was official now. Australia didn't trust the application. And the next step, the one no one in that room wanted to make, had been triggered. But what came next would not come from an email, or a phone call, or even a government office. It would come from someone outside the embassy entirely. Someone who would escalate this situation into a full-blown diplomatic storm. And no one in that room saw it coming. It was the moment everyone in the embassy had hoped to avoid. The moment when the file stopped being an internal curiosity and became something far more serious. Because once the Department of Home Affairs stepped in, everything changed. When a visa application reaches Home Affairs, it means it has left the realm of simple administrative processing. It enters a new world. A realm of national scrutiny, legal evaluation, risk assessment, political balancing, and sometimes damage containment. This was no longer paperwork. This was now a potential national issue, and the officers knew it. The email came through with a bright red flag marker, one of the few indicators that means drop everything and look at this now. The room fell silent as the senior officer opened it, and even before he said a word, everyone felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Because Home Affairs doesn't get involved casually. They don't flag random applications. They don't interrupt embassy workflow unless absolutely necessary. Which meant only one thing. Someone upstairs saw something dangerous. Not dangerous in the criminal sense. Dangerous in the diplomatic, social, or political sense. The kind of danger that governments tread around carefully. The senior officer scanned the message once. Then again. Then a third time, slowly, methodically, as if trying to confirm that the words on the screen were truly real. Finally, he looked up. They want us to pause all processing immediately. A murmur spread through the room like a low growl. Pause meant this wasn't a misunderstanding. Pause meant further investigation. Pause meant deeper concerns had been detected. One officer leaned forward. What exactly does the email say? The senior officer read aloud, his voice steady but laced with tension. The department has identified multiple concerns, including potential discrepancies between the applicant's declared activities and known public commitments. Further review is required before a decision can be made. There it was. The confirmation. The suspicion wasn't paranoia or overreaction. It was real. Another officer asked quietly, What else do they want? The senior officer read the next line. They've requested access to any additional documentation, including communications from the applicants or their representatives. The room went still, because asking for additional communications meant someone at Home Affairs thought the story behind this application wasn't matching the story on paper. Someone thought there was more. Someone suspected something hidden. And the embassy now had a mandate, dig. But why? What made Home Affairs escalate this so quickly? What triggered such a severe reaction? Let's step inside their perspective for a moment. The Department of Home Affairs is responsible for immigration security, border protection, and national risk assessment. They evaluate not just the literal information on an application, but its implications. When a celebrity or public figure enters Australia, their visit creates effects, media presence, public response, political commentary, and potential controversies. If something goes wrong, Home Affairs takes the blame. And if something is unclear, Home Affairs needs to know why. So when they saw the inconsistencies in Meghan's section, the conflicting timelines, the vague attachments, and the unusual notes about personal work, their antenna went up immediately. But that wasn't the only catalyst. The internal intelligence review triggered by the embassy, standard for high-risk applicants, had revealed a memo from another department. A memo that would explain why Home Affairs moved so aggressively. This memo wasn't public. It wasn't new. It wasn't dramatic. But it contained observations about Harry and Meghan that made the department uneasy. Applicant couple may attract high-level media attention and public reaction, which could escalate unpredictably. That line alone was enough to cause caution. But the next line was the real trigger. Past interactions with Australian agencies indicate potential challenges with adherence to local protocols. Translated, they were difficult guests the last time, and that meant the risk of a repeat was high. Home Affairs hates unpredictability. They hate anything that strains resources. They hate last-minute changes. They hate public backlash. And Harry and Meghan, for all their fame, brought all of those risks simultaneously. But even that wasn't the biggest factor. The biggest factor was timing. Australia had recently undergone political shifts, a new wave of public pressure, tighter immigration policies, heightened scrutiny of international visitors with commercial agendas, greater focus on accountability from high-profile individuals. This was not the same Australia Harry and Meghan visited in 2018. Not socially, not politically, not bureaucratically. And the new Australia wasn't willing to hand out special treatment. Meanwhile, inside the embassy, the officers tried to dissect every part of the Home Affairs message, trying to understand how severe the situation would become. One officer asked, "What do they want us to investigate first?" The senior officer replied, "Everything. Everything. Yes, everything." They needed to re-examine every document, every date, every clause, every sentence in the application. But more than that, they needed to cross-check every piece of the Sussexes' public life. Every interview, every news article, every media leak, every public appearance. Because Home Affairs didn't want to approve someone only to discover that their visit would spark outrage or controversy or political debate. And the deeper the embassy dug, the more concerns they found. Let's break them down one by one. Concern number 1, media disruption. The Sussexes have a history of traveling with media crews, often discreetly. Even when they deny filming, cameras appear. Documentaries appear. Interviews appear. Australia cannot afford secret filming. Concern number 2, political sensitivity. Australia's relationship with the British monarchy is under scrutiny. Harry and Meghan's arrival could reignite dormant debates. Debates the government does not want to revisit this year. Concern number 3, public reaction. Polling data indicated a divided public. Half supportive, half critical, half indifferent. A divided public is dangerous. Concern number 4, security strain. Past tours required heavy security. This time, interest would be higher. Protests likely. Crowd control uncertain. Concern number 5, inconsistencies in the application. Harry admitted on the phone they couldn't put everything on paper. That one sentence alone could justify a denial. Concern number 6, stated versus actual intentions. Meghan's wording suggested emotional nostalgia. Her schedule suggested something else entirely. Their PR team's email suggested yet another narrative. 3 narratives. No clarity. Governments do not like unclear intentions. But there was one more concern. The one nobody wanted to say aloud. The one that hung in the room like a silent cloud. Would approving the visit make Australia look like it was taking a side in the Sussex royal family conflict? Because whether Harry and Meghan intended or not, they bring the monarchy with them. In the form of headlines, commentary, speculation, and international attention. And Australia cannot afford to appear entangled in that web. One officer finally voiced the question they were all thinking. Are we being used? There it was. The core fear. The fear that perhaps Harry and Meghan saw Australia as a stage, not a destination. A setting. A backdrop for their next chapter. If there was even a 10% chance that the visit was strategic rather than genuine, Home Affairs would deny the visa, but they weren't ready to deny it yet. They needed one more thing. Proof. And that proof came in an unexpected form. A new packet of information delivered directly from the communications branch. This packet contained detailed professional monitoring of social media patterns and press trends involving the Sussexes. It revealed something startling. Over the last 3 months, multiple public relations firms had been monitoring Australian press coverage of the Sussexes. That alone wasn't suspicious. But the timing was. It overlapped exactly with the period the visa application was prepared. Meaning someone anticipated the trip. Someone expected a narrative shift. Someone expected to leverage Australian media. One communications officer put it plainly. This looks like groundwork for a publicity campaign. Another added, if they want to film or produce anything here, we're in trouble. And Australia is strict, extremely strict, about foreign filming. But then came the twist. The twist that made everyone look at each other with wide eyes. A senior Home Affairs official had attached a short note to the flagged email. The applicant's media behavior in previous international visits may conflict with Australia's public interest criteria. That one line was explosive.